for.
But to all of you here in New York, it wasn't just that personal grace that allows him to say, I want to make a decision to forgive, as Reverend you said, after he had succeeded. But there's a great deal of political pressure not to quote-unquote sell out to the national government at the time, which he had to resist, to say, no, I've got a long view here of where I see this going, and I've got to reassure whites as well.
Well, you cannot really separate his career from Dr. King's career. We were able to end apartheid, so much like a South African apartheid in 1965 was the right to vote. For almost 30 years, we had a lead jump on that right to vote, and used that vote to help empower allies in South Africa, going against our own government's policy. After all, the U.S. partnership and Britain with South Africa that helped prop that system up. Yet he came out with seeing what his options were, and he knew that forgiving and redeeming had more value than retaliation and revenge, because it was the next step. And even today, while we won the apartheid battle against skin apartheid, the surface level, and political right to vote, the apartheid remains, the apartheid gaps in poverty and healthcare and education. We're in the middle of the end of the apartheid struggle even now. It's just changed phases.
Well, I think one of the things that has to be learned, and I quite agree, I think it's a very relevant point that Professor Ogletree makes about him being a patriot. He set the foundation for what he later became. And it was a much different world then than it is now. The Great Cold War was on at that time, and the South African government was aligned with the United States, and people who were seeing that struggle were seeing the South African government as an ally of the United States and not paying enough attention to the big human rights issues. But the big issue going forward now is President Zuma in South Africa, and does he get the lessons from the life and the leadership of President Mandela and the other leaders in Africa, and not just in that continent, but around the world, that they can take something away from that. There are not going to be a lot of people dancing in the streets because they're mourning the loss of Mugabe, for example, in next door in Zimbabwe. But I would hope that the lesson that this week will mean, and the days that come, is that people will see the real value of the kind of leadership that was not self-centered, and it was not based on division but on unification.
I do want to chime in on this. There was a great difference between Nelson Mandela and Dr. King, which I'll get to in 1 second. Our two countries were going on divergent paths. Apartheid is not that old. It came in 1948 with the National Party. At the same time, America was moving towards civil rights, towards the Brown versus Board of Education was a few years later. He realized that South Africa was on the wrong side of history. But he also realized that he had to, when he came out, he had to repair the breach. Part of the reason that he never showed his bitterness, which he did have, was that he knew he had to reconcile white and black for a new South Africa. The white business center was the engine of prosperity for Africa. South Africa could not survive without them. He knew that. And that was one reason that he never showed the anger or bitterness that he did, in fact, have.
The 1896 apartheid decision here laid the groundwork for the 1940 apartheid decision there. We call it segregation, they call it apartheid. It's the same system and the same political and military and diplomatic players. And we had to fight that same system running parallel. Dr. King and Mandela both in jail in '63. Mandela stayed in jail, Dr. King got out, we got the right to vote. And ultimately it was the Black Caucus led by, at that point, Ron Dellums and Maxine Waters and Randall Robinson, really, that helped to get this Congress to declare sanctions very reluctantly against that system. But the impetus to free that system came from the civil rights struggle, not on government policy. And to think, David, that he got off the terrorist list in 2008. I mean, think about that. He out of jail in 19.
He had sort of lingered there.
He got off the terrorist list by George Bush at Condoleezza Rice's urging in 2008.